Here we go. How to split a Husqvarna 372 crankcase. There was a guy on Facebook that was asking, how do you split a crankcase and how many bolts are there? And I'm like, oh, just go check out my videos. I got a full teardown. Well, as it turns out, I don't. I couldn't find where I've actually, on video, split a 372 crankcase. I've done lots of others, but for whatever reason, splitting one of these just hasn't made it into a video. So here it is. Okay, 372 crankcase. You've got basically everything torn down to this level. You do not need to take the dog off. You can, certainly, but you really don't need to. There's this bushing in here that probably needs to come out, plus minus, and there's a teeny tiny little O-ring in there, but we're going to ignore that for the moment. So the bushing comes out. Some people will actually grease them in. Some of them actually glue them in with some Loctite 518. But the way the book has it, there's a little O-ring in there that creates the seal, and it's a complex thing. And I have another video on it, so check that out. But anyway, so the bushing comes out, and we now take the bolts out. Now the bolts are actually on the flywheel side. And there are 6 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So let's hit them. Now I like to use my impact here. It's a 4mm with the impact, and this just makes really quick work of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6. Now these bolts are not exactly proprietary, but they are pretty specific. So if anybody wants information on these bolts in millimeters, they are, well, let's see, overall length I think is 37. I think this is a 30. I think this is classified as a 30mm bolt, but it does have a pilot tip, which is nice. So does make these a little bit on the unique side. So look for the tapered tip if you want to see what case bolts are, and about 30mm long, or rather the thread length is 30mm long. Okay, put those on your metal tray, and once you have all 6 bolts out, you're good. So now what you need is a case splitter. Now there's actually a couple of ways to do this. You can do this with just heat. But, and I've demonstrated this in the other videos, you can do it with just heat, but odds are the bearings are going to stay on the crank. So if the bearings stay on the crank, then you need a bearing puller to get them off the crank. Now I've tried it without a bearing puller. I've tried getting bearings off of a crank with no heat, with no bearing puller, just heat. And it just doesn't work. It's very tricksy. So you really need one of 2 tools. Either you need a bearing puller, assuming you're trying to reuse that particular crank, or a case splitter, and you can actually make one. There are plenty of guys with different style case splitters. The most effective one is the Husqvarna style case splitter here, and this one I think was a Chinese case splitter, and what I ended up doing was the handle that was here was not robust enough, so I used a piece of 5/8 rod, retapped this, and welded a nut on the end so that I can use a ratchet or a socket or whatever. Okay, so at this point you get the case splitter on. Now this case splitter is intended, I believe, to be put in the vise. So you just you can grab there with the vise, and the whole thing ends up upside down. But I don't usually do it like that, but whatever, you can if you want. I just will do it just like this. So then you just turn it down. There you go. Now, some cases are harder to split than others. I had a 262 video that the dog bolts were actually the case bolts, and I forgot to take those out, and or didn't know, and I wrecked the case. Just tore the case right apart. Whoops. So you can screw it up. It is possible. So that's the one case half that comes off there. And this crank, as it turns out, is out of round. So that's what's messing it up. And it was because somebody got this saw nice and hot and then turned, really cranked down on the chain tensioner and then let it cool. And the chain then tensions and often breaks the crank. This didn't break, it just bent. So I'm going to heave-ho this crank. This case half is perfectly good, so I will reuse that. Basically clean it up and reuse it. Hot tip on these 372 case splits. The positioning pins are important. Sometimes you'll get positioning pins that are solid, that don't have the hole in them. This right here is where the other, there are two positioning pins, one here, one here. So this is towards the front of the saw, low on the saw. This is towards the back of the saw, high on the saw. So this one actually has a bolt go through it. This one does not. So if you're looking at the case gasket and you're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bolts, there aren't 7 bolts. There are 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This one does not have a bolt go through it. So if you happen to have a solid positioning pin, guess what? It has to go here. If you put it here, you try to stick a bolt through it, no good. Just a hot tip. Now on the flywheel side, same thing. Connecting rod up. Back this off until you're on the crank. Just like that. And if all goes well, the crank comes out and the bearing stays in the pocket. Sometimes a little tap to persuade it's not a bad thing. There you go. Kapow. And your crank's out, and the bearings are not left on the crank. So that's definitely an important thing. This crank is shot. This is done. Now I have to clean up the case halves. New bearings, new seals, good idea. And yeah, you've seen me do all that stuff before, so you don't need to see that. Just heat up the case and tap the bearings out. And that's about that for splitting a crankcase. So, hope you liked the video. Nice, short, and sweet, as opposed to my usual stuff. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.